In 1855, a British inventor named Henry Bessemer changed the world forever. He patented a device that could blast cold air through molten pig iron, burning off the carbon and producing cheap steel on an industrial scale. It was the single invention that launched the modern age of skyscrapers, railroads, and warships. Bessemer was hailed as a genius. He was knighted. His name became synonymous with the birth of modern steel. But 800 years before Bessemer filed his patent, a Chinese polymath named Shen Kuo walked into an iron district in northern China, watched the workers blast cold air through molten pig iron to burn off carbon and produce steel, and wrote the whole thing down in a book called Dream Pool Essays. Nobody in Europe would read it for centuries. This is not an isolated coincidence. It is the visible tip of one of the most staggering technological gaps in recorded history. It is the 1st century AD. The Roman Empire stretches from the rain-swept hills of Britain to the scorching sands of Egypt. The Romans have concrete, cranes, and an insatiable appetite for luxury goods from the East. We know they were obsessed with silk, but there was another import that Roman generals prized above almost everything else. The historian Pliny the Elder called it Ceric iron, iron from the land of the Ceres, the Roman name for the Chinese. Pliny believed this metal was a natural wonder, perhaps scraped from trees or mined from some mythical pure vein in the earth. He had no idea that what he was holding was not a miracle of nature. It was the product of a state-controlled, military-industrial complex operating blast furnaces, pouring rivers of liquid metal and mass-producing high-carbon steel on a scale that his civilization would not achieve for another 15 centuries. Today we are going to trace that gap from its origins in a chemical loophole that Chinese smelters exploited 500 years before Christ, through the wars it decided, the empires it built and destroyed, all the way to the moment Europe finally caught up. This is the secret history of fire, blood, and steel. 1. The Liquid Revolution. To understand how far ahead China was, you need to understand one brutal physical fact. Pure iron melts at 1,538 degrees Celsius. Ancient European furnaces could not get that hot. They topped out between 800 and 1,100 degrees. So when a Roman blacksmith smelted iron ore, the metal never melted. It formed a spongy, half-solid mass called a bloom, a messy lump of soft iron and glassy rock that had to be beaten with a hammer for hours just to squeeze the waste out. It was exhausting, small-scale manual labor, and it was the only method Europe knew for over 2,000 years. Meanwhile, by the 5th century BC, Chinese engineers had already made iron flow like water. They had a crucial advantage. Generations of advanced pottery and bronze casting had given them kilns that could withstand extreme heat, and they had invented highly efficient bellows to pump continuous oxygen into the flames. But the real breakthrough was a chemical loophole. If you force enough carbon into the iron and add phosphorus-rich minerals as a flux, the melting point plummets. At 4.3% carbon content, iron does not need 1,538 degrees to melt. It melts at just 1,147 degrees. With that single insight, the Chinese were not just making iron. They were operating the world's first blast furnaces, tapping liquid metal directly into molds, and mass-producing tools and weapons while Europe was still hammering sponge. This high-carbon liquid iron, called cast iron, was a revolutionary leap. But it came with a critical flaw. Cast iron is extremely hard, but dangerously brittle. Strike a cast iron sword against a rock, and it will not bend. It will shatter like glass. So the question became, how do you turn brittle glass metal into flexible, deadly steel? The answer involved a technique so counterintuitive that when European metallurgists finally invented the same process, it powered the Industrial Revolution. 2. The stir-frying secret. Imagine taking a wok, placing it over a massive fire, and instead of cooking vegetables, you are stir-frying liquid iron. I am entirely serious. To transform brittle cast iron into tough steel, you have to remove the excess carbon. By the Han Dynasty, beginning in 202 BC, Chinese metallurgists had developed an ingenious technique called chow, a word that literally translates to stir-frying. Here is how it worked. They melted the brittle cast iron in an open hearth. As the liquid metal pooled, a skilled worker used a long iron pole to constantly stir the glowing, molten soup. By exposing the liquid metal to oxygen in the air, the carbon literally burned off. As the carbon levels dropped, the melting point rose, and the liquid soup thickened into a glowing, pasty dough of high-quality wrought iron or steel. In the West, this exact same technique is known as the puddling process. It was patented in England by Henry Kuo in the year 1784. Let that date settle. While Europe was waiting for the 18th century Industrial Revolution to figure out how to efficiently refine liquid iron into steel, China had already mastered it in the 2nd century BC. Archaeological excavations at the Jingfucheng Cemetery in Ningxia have unearthed puddled steel weapons dating to before that period. That is a technological head start of roughly 1,500 years. But producing the steel was only half the problem. To forge a weapon that could slice through armor without snapping in two, Chinese smiths had to master the strange, almost alchemical science of heat treatment. And their methods were as bizarre as they were effective. 3. Blood, fat, and the urine of the earth. If you have ever watched a film about blacksmithing, you know the dramatic climax. The smith pulls the glowing blade from the forge and plunges it into water. A violent hiss of steam. The blade is hardened. Quenching is real physics. When steel is red hot, its crystal structure expands. Rapid cooling traps the carbon atoms inside the lattice, forcing the steel into an extremely hard structure called martensite. But water cools steel too fast. The thermal shock creates massive internal stress. Quench a high-carbon blade in water, and there is a strong chance it will warp. Or worse, you will hear a faint tink, the sound of your blade cracking down the middle. Chinese metallurgists figured this out early. By the Han Dynasty, they had transitioned to using vegetable oils and animal fats as quenching mediums. Oil boils differently than water, wrapping the blade in a vapor jacket that slows and evens out the cooling. The result? Blades with extreme hardness on the cutting edge, but flexibility in the core. And they went much further. In the 1st century AD, a legendary smith named Qi Wu Huaiwen developed specialized quenching techniques using animal grease and animal urine to achieve precise cooling rates. The Chinese written language actually distinguished between these methods. Qi meant quenching in grease, while Yu meant quenching in urine. Ancient records claim that swords treated with the fat and urine of 5 sacrificial animals could pierce 30 layers of armor. Whether that specific claim is legend or fact, the underlying metallurgical principle is sound. Different quenching mediums produce measurably different steel properties. Historical text from the borderlands mentions something even stranger, a substance called di-son, meaning the urine of the earth. Modern scholars identify this as an early form of unrefined petroleum. Ancient Chinese border smiths were performing petroleum-based oil quenches, a technique the modern world considers an industrial age innovation. This level of metallurgical precision was a closely guarded state secret, because in the ancient world, superior steel was not a commodity. It was the difference between imperial survival and total annihilation. And that distinction was about to be tested on the bloodiest frontier of the ancient world. Four. Steel as sovereignty, the Han-Xiongnu Wars. In the 2nd century BC, the Han Dynasty faced an existential threat from the north. The Xiongnu were a vast, nomadic confederation dominating the Eurasian steppes. Born in the saddle, Masters of mounted archery, their mobility was unmatched by any settled army on Earth. In 169 BC, a Han minister named Shen Kuo submitted a military memorandum to Emperor Wen titled, "Guard the frontiers and protect the borders." It was brutally honest. Shen Kuo admitted that Xiongnu horses were faster and that their ability to endure harsh weather far surpassed the Han. But he identified a fatal weakness. The Xiongnu had no industrial metallurgy. Their armor was cured leather, their shields were wood. Many of their arrowheads were tipped with bone or bronze. Against this, the Han were fielding heavy iron armor, long-range mechanized crossbows, and lethal 1-meter-long, high-carbon steel swords, the Jian and the Dao. Shen Kuo declared that in close-quarters combat, the technological gap was so extreme it gave rise to a saying that became proverbial. One Han soldier was worth 5 nomadic warriors. Once Han crossbow volleys forced the Xiongnu to dismount, superior Chinese steel sheared through leather and wood. This industrial advantage allowed the Han dynasty to systematically dismantle Xiongnu hegemony, secure the Hexi corridor, and officially open the Silk Road to the west. Steel had not just won battles, it had drawn the borders of the known world. But empires rise and fall on the flow of knowledge, and the real question is, what happens when the people on the other side of those borders learn to make steel themselves? 5. The blacksmith slaves who conquered the steppe. As the centuries passed, the secrets of steelmaking began to seep beyond the Chinese frontier, and the consequences were explosive. In the 6th century AD, the Eurasian steppes were ruled by the Rouran Khaganate. The Rouran did not do their own metalwork. Instead, they enslaved a vassal tribe living in the Altai Mountains to serve as their personal blacksmiths. Chinese records called these people Jelao, blacksmith slaves. For generations, these captive metalworkers mined the ore, stoked the furnaces, and forged the weapons that kept their masters in power. But in mastering the technology of their oppression, they were quietly building the arsenal of their liberation. In 552 AD, a leader named Bumin Khagan decided his people had hammered enough steel for other men. He armed his tribesmen with the very weapons they had forged, rose up, and annihilated the Rouran. Who were these blacksmith slaves? They were the Gokturks. Armed with industrial-scale steel production, the Gokturks erupted across the map. They equipped a heavy cavalry force, reportedly numbering 300,000 men, and established the first Turkic Khaganate, an empire stretching from the borders of China to the Caspian Sea. It was one of the largest land empires the world had yet seen, and it was built, quite literally, in the forge. The Chinese did not stand idle. During the Tang Dynasty, Chinese metallurgy reached new heights to counter the Turkic threat. Tang smiths produced what they called 100 refined steel, metal repeatedly folded and hammered to purge impurities like sulfur and phosphorus. They paired this ultra-pure steel with a critical new invention, the double metal stirrup, which allowed heavy cavalry to fight with devastating stability from the saddle. In 630 AD, Tang heavy cavalry, clad in overlapping steel lamellar armor, rode out and crushed the eastern Turkic Khaganate. The Silk Road was secured once again, and flowing down that road, alongside silk and spices, traveled the most legendary metal of the ancient world, straight into the forges of the Middle East. 6. The Silk Road superalloy, the truth about Damascus steel. Ask anyone to name the greatest sword steel in history, and the answer is almost always Damascus steel. We have all heard the legends, blades that could slice a falling silk scarf in half, bearing rippling, water-like patterns on the surface. But here is the part of the story that rarely gets told. Damascus steel was not invented in Damascus. The smiths of the Middle East were forging their famous blades using imported ingots of a material called woots. a crucible steel invented in southern India and Sri Lanka. Central Asian cities like Merv and Aksaket developed their own variant called foulard. Unlike the Chinese blast furnace method, crucible steel was made by sealing wrought iron and carbon-rich plant matter inside a clay crucible and baking it at around 1,400 degrees Celsius until it melted into a pure, slag-free puck of high-carbon steel. Because the Silk Road connected distant civilizations, the Chinese quickly encountered this exotic metal. Texts from the Sui and Tang dynasties refer to it as bin iron, imported from Sasanian Persia and the so-called Western barbarians. Chinese officials were fascinated by its quality, noting surface patterns that resembled spiraling water, sesame seeds, or snowflakes. But the Chinese did not simply buy and admire it. They reverse-engineered the concept and created something arguably superior. They developed a hybrid technique called guanzhou, irrigated steel. The process was elegant and violent. Take bars of soft, flexible wrought iron and pour molten, high-carbon cast iron directly over them. The two metals co-fuse, creating a composite blade with a razor-sharp hard edge backed by a shock-absorbing flexible core. It was the pinnacle of pre-modern weapon technology, a marriage of two metallurgical traditions that met on the Silk Road. And this relentless drive for better steel culminated during the Song Dynasty, when Chinese industry reached a scale that makes the numbers almost impossible to believe. 7. The Song Zenith and the 800-year head start. By the 11th century, China's iron industry was experiencing a crisis of its own success. The blast furnaces were so massive and demand so enormous that northern China was being stripped of its forests for charcoal fuel. So they pivoted. Centuries before the West, Chinese smelters substituted charcoal with bituminous coal and coke, pushing furnace temperatures even higher and production through the roof. By the year 1078, the Song Dynasty was producing an estimated 125,000 tons of iron per year. For perspective, the entire nation of England would not reach 80,000 tons annually until the 1760s. It was during this era that the polymath Shen Kuo wrote his Dream Pool essays and documented the technique we opened this story with. He visited the iron districts and described workers taking molten pig iron, blasting it with a fierce current of cold air to rapidly oxidize the carbon and producing steel. That is the exact mechanism of the Bessemer converter, the invention credited with launching the modern steel age in 1855. Shen Kuo documented a functional prototype more than 800 years before Henry Bessemer filed his patent. While Europe was still centuries away from melting iron at all, China was running coal-fired blast furnaces, operating hydraulic bellows powered by water wheels, and refining steel through techniques the West would not independently develop until the Industrial Revolution. So the obvious question is, if China was this far ahead, why did the knowledge never reach Europe? Why did the West wait 1,500 years to close the gap? Eight, the geopolitical wall. The answer lies at the intersection of geography, politics, and economics. First, the Silk Road was not an ancient internet. It was a brutal relay system of middlemen. A Roman merchant never sat down with a Chinese metallurgist. Goods changed hands a dozen times across thousands of miles. Pliny could examine the final product, but he had no way to trace the industrial process behind it. Second, the Chinese state treated steelmaking technology as a military secret enforced by the threat of death. Since 117 BC, the Han government held a strict imperial monopoly on iron production. Ironworks were massive, centralized, state-run factories employing hundreds of workers. Officials understood that steel was the foundation of military survival. Exporting the knowledge of how to build a blast furnace was a capital offense. And third, even if the knowledge had leaked, Europe lacked the infrastructure to use it. The Chinese indirect process required giant furnaces, highly refractory ceramic clays to contain molten slag, and complex water wheels driving continuous air blasts. Medieval Europe was politically fragmented, its iron production scattered among independent village blacksmiths who had neither the capital, the labor, nor the organizational capacity to build a liquid-state iron industry. The West remained locked in the bloomery age, hammering solid, spongy iron one piece at a time, while China had already engineered the industrial prototype that would eventually transform the modern world. 9. The metal that drew the map. Stand back far enough, and the pattern is unmistakable. Chinese steel did not just decide individual battles. It shaped the political geography of the ancient world. It secured the Hexi Corridor and opened the Silk Road. It armed the Gokturks and redrew the map of Central Asia. It flowed through Silk Road caravans and merged with Indian crucible steel to produce the legendary blades of Damascus. And when Song Dynasty engineers began blasting cold air through molten iron 8 centuries before Bessemer, they were not performing some quaint proto-experiment. They were running a functional steel industry that outproduced all of Europe combined. But Pliny the Elder never knew any of this. He turned that piece of cerric iron over in his hands and marveled at its quality. He speculated about trees and mythical veins of pure metal. He recorded his wonder in natural history, and then he moved on. He died in 79 AD, suffocated by the eruption of Vesuvius, still believing that the finest steel on earth was a gift from nature, never suspecting that thousands of miles to the east, a civilization had been engineering it by the ton for 500 years, guarding the secret behind walls of geography, politics, and the penalty of death. He was holding 15 centuries of industrial supremacy in his hands, and he called it magic,